$3.5 trillion reckless tax and spending spree, the absolutely worst possible thing we could be doing in our country right now. Playing Russian roulette with this economic recovery, which has already been threatened by this raging inflation created by the rescue package earlier this year. These taxes are going to hit the country really hard. There was a Wall Street Journal article a couple of days ago featuring a landlord in my state who had been investing over the years in rental property in order to guarantee his retirement. This would affect, under these capital gains increases that they have in mind, it basically would cut his assets in half. In half. This is a devastating proposal, whether it's corporate tax increases, pass-through tax increases, capital gains tax increases, stepped-up basis, an absolutely devastating blow to our economy at the worst possible time.
Well, as the leader pointed out, we know what's coming next, and that is the Democrats' reckless $3.5 trillion tax and spending spree. And we know it's going to raise taxes on middle-income Americans. I am particularly concerned and interested in this subject because agriculture is our #1 industry in South Dakota, and farmers and ranchers stand to bear the brunt of a lot of these tax increases. There was a study done by Texas A&M, and in their 30-state region that that is contained in their database, they said that every farm and ranch operation would be impacted, and that the average tax liability for farm or ranch operation in this country would be $700,000 under the Biden proposal. In South Dakota, and like a lot of states that are represented here today, we have generationally owned, family-owned small businesses, farms and ranches. You want to see them to be able to pass that on to the next generation. And what this double death tax would do, as the leader alluded to, not only do you have the death tax, which hits these farm and ranch operations, but now you will have this new increased capital gains tax, which does away with what's called the step-up in basis, which dramatically increases the tax liability for people in this country. And we're not talking about rich people. The gentleman that the leader referred to in Kentucky pays himself $75,000 a year. He invested in these apartment buildings 27 years ago, and he was hoping at the age of 64 to be able to have a little nest egg for retirement. And his tax advisor has told him that it would reduce his take-home pay, or what he would get out of the sale of that asset, by a half. He'd end up with a half of what he was looking at for his own retirement after investing for 27 years in that business enterprise. That's going to happen repeatedly all across the country if what the Biden tax plan and the Democrats' reckless tax and spending spree here on Capitol Hill is allowed to go forward. We are going to do everything that we can to stop it. We are going to stand with middle-income Americans who are going to be hit, and again bear the burden of paying for all this new massive increases in spending that the Democrats are proposing. And we just think that the American people, when they find out what's going on, no matter their income class, are going to say enough already. And we're going to be there with them, trying to stop this at every turn. And we expect that when this is all said and done, the American people, when they render a verdict on this idea, it's going to be a big thumbs down. Next up is Senator Barrasso.
Well, you talk to the Democrats, and they are actually eager to jump to this reckless tax and spending spree. It's going to start next week. We've already spent $6 trillion in coronavirus relief, and now they're talking about $3.5 to $5 trillion more of big government spending. It is time for the American people to stand up and speak out and say, we've had enough. It is time to stop, because the American people realize every one of them is in one way or another going to pay for this. They're suffering right now. Their paychecks are getting eaten away by inflation. $25 more a week every time you fill up with gas, $25 more a week when you go to the grocery store. So it's $50 less a week that you have to spend for other things, just to buy the same amount of groceries and the same amount of gas that you were at the time that Joe Biden became president. We're talking about thousands of dollars a year eaten away from Americans' paychecks. And it's not just the inflation component. The amount of money they're talking about spending, the only way they can do that is significantly raising taxes. It's not just going to be on a couple of rich people or a couple of big companies. The amount of spending is so dramatic that everybody will be paying in one way or another. People are going to get hit in their savings, in their investments, in their retirement accounts. That is what's going to happen to each and every one of the folks in America who see what the Democrats are trying to do here. And the Democrats have been very upfront about the fact they are ready to supersize the IRS to go after all of the taxpayers in America to make sure they get every last dime from them. It's time for the American people to stand up, speak out, and say enough is enough.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you. And these are concerning times. And we've heard over and over again about Bernie and Biden's reckless $3.5 trillion spending spree that will be happening very soon. And they really haven't been eager to talk about how this is going to impact middle-class Iowans and how they'll be taxing them to pay for their scheme. And it's time for Bernie and President Biden to level with the American people. And one example is one that Senator Thune brought up, because it does impact Iowans heavily. Agriculture is also our number one industry in the state of Iowa. And that example is the farm-to-table tax that the Democrats are proposing on our farmers and our small business owners. And Bernie and Biden, what they're going to do, they're going to hit Iowa's family-owned businesses. Most of those farms out there, they are modest farms. They are family-owned. And what we consider this? A double death tax. It is a double death tax. And that's on top of rising prices, inflation, all of that, which we all know is basically a tax in itself. So this Bernie and Biden's tax and spending spree is going to be paid for one way or another by our middle-class Iowans, middle-class Americans. And you know what? Our Senate Republicans, we're going to stand up against it. We are going to stand with our hardworking Americans. Thank you.
Senator Scott.
Well, first off, $30 trillion worth of debt is pretty scary. And that's what we're getting close to. When I became governor of Florida, we had a $4 billion budget deficit, and we had increased the debt. The state had increased its debt $1 billion every year. And everybody wanted to spend more money on things. And so what we did was we did what we should be doing up here. We started paying down our debt. We grew our economy, which allowed us to have record money for education, for the environment, for transportation, all these things. And we kept cutting taxes. And every time we cut taxes and fees, we kept getting more money. And more people moved to our state, and we grew our economy. We've got to do the same thing up here. And what we can't do is raise taxes on people. There's not enough money to raise taxes on the rich. And by the way, in the American Rescue Plan, the Democrats already raised tax on Uber drivers, DoorDash drivers, people like that, which is to the gig workers, which is completely unfair. And it's exactly the opposite of what they said they were going to do. But if you look at it, they want to just tax the rich. There's not enough money. Well, if you look at how much money they're spending, if they're going to pay for it, which eventually the market's going to, people are not going to buy our debt if we don't have ability to pay it back. They're going to have to tax everybody, and it's not fair. It's not fair to people that are working hard. They can't do this at their house. They have to watch how they have to live within their means. They don't run up debt like this, and we can't do it here, and the taxes will be completely unfair.
Thanks, Scott. Senator Blackburn.
I absolutely love getting home to Tennessee every weekend and talking to Tennesseans about what they perceive to be happening here in Washington. And it is so interesting to get their take on what is going on with these taxes. Last weekend, I had a guy that came up to me and he said, during the Obama years, I always felt like I had too much month left at the end of my money. And then we got the Trump tax cuts, and I felt like I had a little money left at the end of the month. And that was a good feeling. And it gave them the ability to do some things they wanted to do for their family. And now, Tennesseans talk regularly about what they fear is going to happen. What they fear is going to happen. Now, we've got a chart right over here that talks about America's debt. If you go from George Washington to George Bush, the day he walked out of the Oval Office, you're at about $10.6 trillion in debt. You look at the increase, close to double through the Obama years. You have President Trump, and then, of course, we have what we spent on COVID. And Senator Barrasso talked a little bit about that. And then you look at what has happened since Joe Biden went into the White House and the amount of debt that they're continuing to add. This is record spending. It is reckless spending. It is raising taxes in order to allow reckless spending, spending that my two grandsons, who are aged 12 and 13, and my granddaughter, who is now 11 months old, they are going to have to pay this bill because the bill is going to come due on them. And it is going to compromise their hopes, their dreams, their opportunities. It is why we as Republicans have to stop this spending spree.
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of being the ranking member on agriculture. So I visit with lots of farmers as they come to Washington, and I get to go throughout the country and visit with them at their meetings. And I'll give you two examples of how this affects them. In being at their meetings on several occasions, they talk about all of the difficulties that they see in the future. They're concerned about waters of the U.S. They're concerned about increased regulation. They're concerned about inflation, the price of fertilizer going up, all the things that make it very, very difficult for them to make a profit. But several of the members, as they have approached and talked to their groups, they pause and say, but that's nothing compared to if the stepped-up basis tax comes into effect. They understand, after visiting with their accountants and this and that, the devastating impact that it would have. We commissioned Texas A&M. It's not John Bozeman saying this. It's not their accountants. We commissioned Texas A&M, who is really the leader in this type of economic research, to look at the farms that they were following. 98% would be affected dramatically. The average was $720,000. State Forester was from Arkansas, who's actually the National State Forester, testified before our committee a few weeks ago. He said that if this goes into effect, it would be devastating to the agriculture community. You say, well, John, why are they doing this? Well, they realize that they've got to have some taxes coming in. They're searching every corner because of the chart. Even they realize that the chart can't continue to go up as it is. You have to have some pay-fors. These pay-fors, again, would be devastating to American agriculture.
Senator Cornyn.
As bad as the Democrats' reckless tax and spending spree is, the story actually gets worse than what you've heard. Because growing up, I remember learning about the story of Robin Hood. Robin Hood stole from the rich to give to the poor. But actually, the Democrats want to take money from hardworking, middle-income American families and give it to the rich. Now, you have not heard that very often, but let me give you just a couple of examples. For example, they want to eliminate the cap on deductibility for state and local taxes so that wealthy Democrats, mainly in blue parts of the country, can have you and me and my constituents in Texas subsidize them. These are wealthy people who can afford to pay, but they want to make a transfer from middle-income people to wealthy people living in blue states. And then when it comes to their energy agenda, you've heard about electric vehicles. I've got nothing against electric vehicles, but I do question whether you and I and my 29 million constituents ought to subsidize electric vehicles so that rich people can drive around and feel good about themselves. with the $7,500 tax credit, and obviously a lot of subsidies that would be included and benefits be included in this reckless tax and spending extravaganza bill in pursuit of this ideology, really, of a completely renewable energy economy. This is raising money or taxing middle-income Americans, including Texans, to give money to their rich constituents. It's the anti-Robin Hood.
Senator Kramer.
Well, it'd be hard to improve on what Ranking Member Bozeman said, and certainly my colleagues from the Midwest, Senator Ernst and Senator Thune and others. So let me give what's a pretty average, probably, example from Realville, North Dakota. It would not be unusual for a great-great-grandfather to have purchased land at $20 an acre. It would not be at all unusual that today that would be worth $2,000 an acre. You eliminate step-up in basis. If you have 100 acres valued at $2,000 an acre, you are suddenly taxing a whole bunch more money that no one did a thing other than produce food for a hungry world on for 5 generations. Secondly, their input costs have been skyrocketing thanks to inflation. The price, frankly, the prices they've been getting in the last several years have not been all that great. Not to mention things like floods and droughts and hail and the other things that make farming so difficult. But let's just double the tax on that increased amount that you aren't getting any more money for. And that's what the capital gains tax proposal does. And worse, after all of that, if in fact there's an estate tax bill that comes due that's based on a lower threshold than what we're talking about today, that means more of the estate is going to be taxed if in fact it changes hands between generations. And suddenly you have an outcome that's not just a farmer with the $725,000 tax hit. You have a farmer who has to sell his family farm just to stay alive. That should not be anybody's goal. I'm embarrassed that it is, or maybe they just don't know. Now they should.
Thanks, Kevin. Questions? A couple quick questions. Yes, sir.
Senator Thune, yesterday we saw the House Progressives sort of flex their muscles for the first time with the eviction moratorium. How concerned are you that could derail some of the moderation in the budget reconciliation with Senators Manchin and Sinema? Because you're counting on them to sort of keep the price in line, even though you don't agree with it in general. So how do you see that sort of playing in the future in this and in other battles between the House and the Senate?
Well, I think that the Bernie Sanders wing of the party is the tail wagging the dog. I think that the progressive wing is where the energy is. It's where the political money is on their side, and so when they pretty much when they play the music, Democrats up your dance, and I just think that's the way it's going to be. I think you're going to have a lot of pressure. Particularly on people like Sinema and Manchin, who otherwise might be inclined to vote for less in taxes, vote for less spending, that are going to be under enormous amounts of pressure because that wing of their party, in both the House and frankly in the Senate, I think is really ascendant today. Yeah.
You said that you guys would try and do whatever you could to stop this. Is there any possibility you would consider trying to deny quorum if needed?
Well, that was a suggestion that Lindsay was being creative with, and my guess is that that's probably not something that ends up happening. But I do think whatever we can do between now and whenever the budget resolution, or when the budget resolution comes up, and then follow on the reconciliation bill, we're going to do everything we can to stop them. And I hope that we have some Democrats who will help, because if this is in size and scope and scale what we hear and believe it's going to be, is going to be catastrophic for a lot of folks around the country, namely a lot of the farmers and ranchers who would get hit with the double death tax. I mean, think about what they're talking about here. This has never happened before. They're talking about taxing unrealized gains. Not only do you get a death tax, but they're raising the capital gains tax rate from 20% up to a high rate of 43.4% for people in the high income categories. But they're also applying that to a lot more income which hasn't been realized yet. I mean, this is unprecedented as a matter of tax policy, but it's an example of the extremes that they have to go to raise the amount of revenue they need to pay for all this spending. Yes, ma'am.
Just looking past the reconciliation process with respect to the debt limit, it seems unlikely that Democrats may fold that into the reconciliation package and may potentially be tying that to a short-term government spending bill. What is your position on that? Would it change your position on a debt limit increase?
I think that they need to do the debt limit at 50. I mean, they literally are trying to, the amount of spending, the amount of taxation they're talking about, and frankly, that they've already done. I mean, they did $2 trillion, as has been pointed out already earlier this year, which has given us this inflation problem that everyone's been talking about that's affecting every American's pocketbook. But if they try and do $3.5 trillion, or what many are arguing, if you look at real dollars over the true window of time there, about $5 to $5.5 trillion in spending, then they ought to own raising the debt. I mean, they're the ones that are adding to it, and they ought to do that under their 51 vote majority. I can't think of a single Republican who wants to help them do that.
Last question.
Here.
So how much help or cover do you think you might get from the parliamentarian in this process? Obviously, Democrats are trying to put a ton of stuff like immigration changes and things like that into this bill. And how aggressively do you plan to lobby to use the rules to your advantage to keep stuff like that out of whatever they bring to the floor?
Both sides will no doubt be working the refs, and the parliamentarian is the referee. And my observation in the past, at least, is then she tries to play it down the middle. And I don't think that she's going to try and advantage one side or the other, but expect them to make every possible effort to include things that are completely unrelated to spending or revenue, which is what the threshold should be under a reconciliation bill, or otherwise you're in violation of the Byrd Rule. I think they're going to try and draw loose connections to everything they do, including immigration. But it has to have a direct impact, not an indirect impact on spending or revenue. So if they come up with policy measures that are, like I said, where they have to manufacture some argument that it fits somehow within the parameters for what's allowed, I hope that they get busted for it. And we'll have people there that are working them too. And I think, this is a hard job, and I'm not suggesting that it's not. I think that there is, if you look historically in previous bills like this where this mechanism has been used, both sides try to talk to the parliamentarian, but it's clearly outside the realm of what it was intended for if it's designed to make major policy changes that are unrelated to spending and revenue. That is the purpose of this, and it should not be abused and misused, and we will fight at every turn their attempts to do that. Thanks, guys.